Hello, folks, and welcome to the last piece of the bones and skeletal tissue puzzle. And that is going to be all about bone structure. And there's going to be three different sections of bone structure. First is going to be gross anatomy, which is what we're going to start off with. It's all about things you can see with the naked eye. That means it's macroscopic. And then we're going to go into microscopic anatomy, things you would need, of course, a microscope for. And then finally, we're going to end with the composition of actual bones. And that is the chemical composition. We already said that the extracellular matrix of this osseous tissue is going to be collagen fibers, which we know. It's going to give that flexibility, and also inorganic portions that are going to be our calcium, phosphates, and other minerals. Because there are many bone types, as we already discussed, and we focus on shape and sometimes even location for those different bone types, we want to just say if we had all the bone types in front of us, how would we be able to connect them all together? To do that is by observing the bones and seeing how they are organized. And there's two main structural arrangements of bone. That's going to be true for flat bones. It's going to be true for, of course, regular bones, long bones, and short bones. Let's get into the first type of structural arrangement, which is spongy bone. Yes, it does look like a sponge, but I like to think of it as a lattice. And so we have like all these little lattice structures here. There's a lattice structure here as well. And the reason why it looks like a sponge is because it has a lot of holes in it, right? And so when you think of a sponge, you know you can squeeze sponges and they're very squishy at that point. But spongy bone is not squishy. It's very hard. Otherwise, our bones will be very squishy on the inside. And no, we don't have that. So I like to think of it as a lattice because a lattice is built off of scaffolding, and how the lattice is connected together is basically based on like supporting rods, for example. Let's say I do have a crystalline structure here, and you'll see that we have supporting rods connecting this face with this face in the back. Okay, we also have supporting rods here. And those supporting rods are going to help keep that lattice structure in place. And what else do we notice? We notice that inside of that lattice structure is going to be a lot of space. That's the reason why when you're looking at spongy bone, you see that there's a lot of holes, and then you see that those holes have a lot of space. And here's a better picture of that. You see a bunch of holes here and here, all these holes here, and then you have supporting pieces that are helping connect all of that spongy bone together. Okay? Now, those supporting pieces can also be called struts. And so we call them bone struts. And when I'm thinking of bone struts, I'm thinking of, again, a supporting bar. One easy way to think of it is if you have a simple bridge, and you know there's always going to be like little supporting bars on that bridge. And of course, there's still going to be empty space between it. And so those will be considered a strut at that point. And the goal of having these struts is that, or trabeculae, is that it's going to reduce weight. And so what does that mean? It means that because we have a lot of extra space in the spongy bone, it's going to weigh less. And that makes sense because if you have a bone and they all are completely compact, no holes in it at that point on the inside, then guess what? It's going to be super heavy, which is going to make it even harder to move around. Now, the next question is, okay, well, what is going to be filled in all these empty spaces here? All these little empty spaces, guess what they're going to be filled with? Bone marrow. All these little empty spaces here are going to be filled with bone marrow. And that means it could be filled with red bone marrow, which is the majority of what you see when you are a young child, or again, yellow bone marrow, which we'll talk about both of these as well, which is going to be as you grow and age. Okay. Now, normally with spongy bone, you are going to see that in the middle of the bone. What does that mean? That means if I took a short bone and I did a cross section or a slice of it, then in the middle of it, I will find all of this spongy bone and this little like lattice structure, right? The only main exception is going to be long bones. Okay, so we have our femur here. And this is two pieces of pictures of a femur. And yes, we see all of our spongy bone here, but we also see that we have a hollow cavity. We're going to talk about that as we go along. That hollow cavity is called the medullary cavity. And in the medullary cavity, you don't have that spongy bone. You're only going to have compact bone. And I just also want to tell you all that this is a piece of a skull. So you can see the compact bone or the hard bone that doesn't have any spaces. And then you have the spongy bone in between. Okay? Now, compact bone is going to look solid. Why? Because there's no visible spaces. They don't have all those little holes in them. And what else does that mean? It means that they're going to be optimized for strength and hardness. This makes sense because if you have one of the functions of bone being protection, then you don't want all of your marrow to just spill out of it. You want to make sure that the outer portion of the bone is protected. And so that's where that compact bone comes in. That way it can definitely embrace impact of hit or something like that, and you'll be able to protect all the stuff on the inside of the bone. And you usually see compact bone on the edges of all bone and the shaft of long bone. So again, when it comes to compact bone, the exception is going to be long bone. So you can organize yourself and say, okay, short bones, or regular bone, and flat bones are all going to be compact bone on the outside, spongy bone completely on the inside. If I was to take a cross section of it, that's what you'll see. But if you're dealing with long bones, like your humerus or your femur, for example, or even your finger and toe bones, then guess what? You know that it's going to have compact bone on the outside, a hollow cavity because it is a long bone, and then at the tops, it's going to have the tops of the proximal end and, of course, the distal end. It will have that spongy bone. Of course, our goal is to get into detail with that. I do want to make a clear distinction here. Now, spongy bone we know is going to have all these little holes, but we also know about osseous tissue when it comes to compact bone. We know that we have osteons that have that central canal. That central canal is not a hole that you will see in spongy bone. It's a canal for blood and nerve. Okay, so just keep those in mind as we're going along. We know that as far as organization, bones are made of spongy bone and compact bone. Now the question is, are they surrounded by anything? I mean, when we thought about our cartilage tissue, for example, we know that they have the perichondrium. So for example, of elastic cartilage, it had perichondrium that was help supplying those nutrients. But with osseous tissue or bone, we know that it definitely has central canals and it has a nutrient foramen that we'll talk about later that allows for blood vessels and also nerves to go in. But guess what? It still has connective tissue like the periosteum and the endosteum that's going to help provide blood, nerve, and attachment points for our bones themselves. Another thing that's really cool is that it has another type of bone cell called the osteoprogenitor cell that is composed of bone stem cells. Now, what is a stem cell? A stem cell has the ability to differentiate. So if we're talking about how do we get osteoblasts, how do we get osteocytes, how do we get osteoclasts, then yes, those osteoprogenitor cells can build those osteoblasts, and then of course everything else goes through that. And it also can build our osteoclasts. All right, let's talk about the first connective tissue covering, which is going to be periosteum. So peri is going to mean around, osteum means bone. So this is going to be around the bone. That means it's going to be attached to that compact bone, okay? This is going to cover the outside surface of the bone, and it's made of 2 layers. The first layer is going to be our fibrous layer. So yes, it's going to be superficial. And guess what? It's made of dense, irregular connective tissue. It also has collagen, and it's going to be vascular and innervated. So it has those blood vessels and nerves, okay? Now, this is going to be collagen from tendons and ligaments. And guess what they do? They actually weave into the fibrous layer, and they even can weave into the bone themselves. The bone itself, excuse me. Talk about tendons, which is connecting muscle and bone. You want to make sure that that connection is tight, right? You don't want to just move your arm and all of a sudden everything just starts breaking apart. So having that collagen from those tendons and having the ability to have this fibrous layer is going to make sure that muscle and bone is connected. And then of course we have our ligaments, which means we're connecting bone and bone. And again, you want that to be a strong connection. The collagen fibers are going to be the attachment point for those tendons and ligaments. Now, of course, you still need to reinforce that actual strength and make sure you reinforce the attachment itself. And what we use is perforating fibers. These are collagen fibers that are going to enter the bone matrix So yes, it weaves itself into the bone matrix itself. That's going to make it even more strong and powerful for those tendons and ligament connections. And just think about it. Never forget that these collagen fibers are rope-like. Okay, these rope-like proteins. And so just imagine being able to tie a lot of different rope and attach a lot of different rope and weave it into the actual bone itself. That's going to provide a lot more structure too. Now, the second layer of the periosteum is going to be the osteogenetic layer. So osteoprogenitor cells, or you can just simply call them bone stem cells, are used to help create different types of bone cells. So again, you start with osteoprogenitor cells. They can form osteoblasts or osteoclasts. And then, of course, osteoblasts can become osteocytes. And this is going to line the bone outer surface. So these two layers are very important. Let's see how they look like in a more enhanced view. So here we have a bone. This is definitely going to be looking like our long bone here. And we're going to take a piece of the outer layer, and that's what you see here. Now, let's go ahead and start labeling some stuff. Remember those collagen fibers and also our perforating fibers? That's going to be here. Collagen and the perforating fibers. Okay? And then we talked about the osteogenitor cells. That's going to be here. Osteoprogenitor cells. So that's going to make up the periosteum. And think about it. Remember, the bone they're living and dynamic. So if we definitely need to keep on making bone or remodeling, having those osteoprogenitor cells available right on the outside, having the connection and weaving into the bone matrix with those collagen fibers and those perforating fibers are really going to be great for us, right? Now let's get into the second type of covering, which is going to be the endosteum. Endo means within. And then, of course, we already know osteum means bone. And so when you're thinking about this, it's like, okay, within bone, what does that mean? Guess what? It's going to align most of the bone because it's going to align the inside of the bone. So all those different trabeculae, and let me go back to that. All those trabeculae that we saw here are going to be lined with our endosteum. All of this is lined with endosteum. And then that cavity that we see here as well is going to be lined with endosteum. All of it. And so, again, you can also say this is going to line all inner surfaces of bone. And it is made of the same composition as the osteogenic layer. So, again, it's basically made of those bone stem cells, which means it can give rise to any type of bone cell that is needed. And so we take another little section here of the endosteum, then we're definitely going to see that it's going to be covering all of the different lining of spongy bone, and of course, if we're talking about a long bone, the cavity of the medullary cavity. And we'll be getting more details on the medullary cavity as we go along. So we've definitely got our understanding of spongy and compact bone, and of course, the connective tissue that surrounds it. Let's get into some other pieces of the bone that we want to see, and that's going to be our bone marrow. And there's two types of tissue that fill the space inside of a bone. And those are going to be the red marrow and the yellow marrow. So the red marrow, red blood, is going to be the site of hematopoiesis, or the formation of blood cells. So this is only going to be found in spongy bone in adults. And then it's going to be a primary marrow type in children. Or more specifically, babies. Okay? At this femur here, you see that this is going to be the femur of a child. And as you can see, there's a lot of red marrow. Now, why do we need red marrow? Is because when you are growing and you're a baby, you're going to need a lot of nutrients to help you grow. And so you're going to be creating platelets, red blood cells, and white blood cells, or components of blood. All right? So that's the whole goal. Now, we're not saying that when you're an adult, you don't have any red bone marrow in these areas, but mainly it's going to be in the spongy bone. That's where you're going to get a lot of your red blood cells from. Okay? Now, as you continue to grow into an adult, the primary marrow type you're going to have as an adult is the yellow marrow. And that means we're going to have triglycerides. Yes, we're going back to our chapter 2 information. Triglycerides are fat, and that's what yellow marrow is. It's yellow because it has a tinge of yellow like adipose tissue or fat does. And those triglycerides are there for fat storage. And also, of course, if you need energy, that's where you're putting a lot of energy in fat storage as well. Now, this is found in spongy bone and the medullary cavity. So, what does that mean? Yes, we're going to have it in long bones in the medullary cavity. That's what's going to be filled in that shaft that we're going to talk about next. And also, we're going to have some yellow marrow in the spongy bone areas. And so here's what's cool about as you grow up. As you grow up, your body doesn't need as much blood anymore. Okay? So your red marrow that's in the spongy tissue will revert to yellow marrow and store more fat, right? But of course, that yellow marrow, if you actually need blood to be produced, that yellow marrow can revert to red marrow. So yellow can go to red if necessary. And it just depends on your body's needs at that point. So this is what we do when it comes to the red and yellow marrow. Let's move on to the next piece. I'm going to talk about bone structure in general. Let's get specific now. And our focus is going to be dividing the classification of bones into two. So one group is going to be the short, flat, and irregular bones, and the other group is what's left, the long bones, okay? So when we're talking about short, flat, and irregular, yes, you can include the sesamoid bone, but the only difference is because that's created in a tendon, you will not have any periosteum, okay? So just keep that in mind. All right, this is going to be an irregular bone. Why? Because it looks like a vertebrae, excuse me. And that means if you had a piece of the vertebrae in your hand, you'll be able to see areas that are thick. And it has an odd shape, but there's areas that are thick as well. Okay? Now, when it comes to short, flat, and irregular bones, this is what their overall gross anatomy is. The inside of the bone is going to be spongy bone. Now, we know that's going to be lined with endosteum. Okay? And the outside surface of the bone is going to be compact bone. And that's going to be lined with periosteum. So here we have the anterior view, and we also have our posterior view here. And it looks like we have a transverse view or a cross section. And what did we notice? We noticed that we have our spongy bone in here. You can see those holes. Spongy bone. And then surrounding the overall bone itself is going to be the compact bone. So it's basically protecting all the sponginess in there as well. Okay? The exception here is going to be the sesamoid bones. There is no periosteum. Why? Because they're surrounded by tendon. So they don't even have the ability to develop periosteum at that point. Let's move on to the long bones. Now here's the gross anatomy of a long bone, okay? The long bone, as we said, is going to be a shaft with two wide ends. You're thinking of a long bone. Of course, these will be our wide ends. But instead of having those general terms, we get to up the ante. We get to get actual terms for the shaft, actual terms for the wide end. So let's talk about our wide ends first. And yes, this is going to be our femur bone here. And what we can see is wide end here, wide end here. And the wide ends are called epiphysis. Now that little epi prefix is going to be regarding something that's on top of or at the end. So it's going to be on top or at the end, okay? And so when you're thinking of epiphysis, then you see that these wide ends of the long bone are going to be at the end of the long bone. There you go. And then the next question might be, wait up, professor, there's two areas of an epiphysis. So we'll write epi here, and we see there's two of them. So we'll say those, we have two epiphyses. Okay, so that's going to be the plural version. Now at the end of those epiphyses, even though it's the end of the actual long bone, but at the end of the epiphyses, it's going to be articular cartilage. So all this little piece right here, and then all this little area right here is going to be articular cartilage. And that's going to cover the epiphysis at the joint. Now, we already know what type of cartilage this is because we talked about this. It's that good old hyaline cartilage. Why is it going to be hyaline cartilage? Because remember, as babies, as your fetus, as your embryo, as you get larger and larger and larger, your goal is to be all hyaline cartilage until you grow into developing your bones. And so when you get to the hyaline cartilage, the goal is to keep on lengthening your bones and stretching and stretching and stretching until you actually start forming the spongy bone and compact bone. Would articular cartilage be very important for the ends of the epiphyses and of course areas where there's going to be joints? Remember, hyaline cartilage does what? It is going to reduce friction. So we want to be able to make sure our bones are not rubbing together causing friction, but they can glide over one another. And that's why this articular cartilage is very important. Now, when your articular cartilage starts to break down, then guess what? You're going to start getting a lot of pain because there is going to be that grinding. It's not going to have that reduction in friction there. We're going to get into diaphysis. And so dia means through. Okay? And the way I think of it is like, okay, it means that it's going to be going through an actual long bone shaft. And so I would say diaphysis here, and as you can see, is going through the actual long bone. And our femur, just to let you know, is the longest bone of the body. So you can keep that in mind as well. And again, diaphysis is going to be the shaft. Okay, so it's going to be this tubular shaft of bone. And that cavity that we're talking about is the medullary cavity. So we've been talking about medullary cavity over and over and over again. Now we get to see it, folks. Here's the medullary cavity, and that's the space inside of the diaphysis. And this is going to contain that yellow bone marrow. What we also notice about the diaphysis is that it's made of mainly compact bone only. You don't see any spongy bone here. So this is what makes the long bones so specific and unique and why they're an exception, right? It's because they're not completely filled with spongy bone that then if you make a cross section of it, you'll just see only spongy bone. No, they have spongy bone in the epiphyses, and then they also have a medullary cavity in the diaphysis that is only made of compact bone. So these areas will be thick at that point, okay? I know some of you are thinking, well, if we're supposed to be starting off with all this hyaline cartilage, where is all that at here? Why do we only have this articular cartilage at the end of the epiphysis? That's because that line of cartilage that we have that's going to allow the bone to grow when we're babies, it's going to stop until we reach puberty, or once we reach puberty. So you can say until puberty is finished. So the area where the epiphyses and diaphyses are going to meet is usually called the epiphyseal plate or the epiphyseal line. And you'll notice what those lines are based on the age of the actual patient that you see or different x-rays. Into these areas where we have the epiphyses here of this femur bone, this one is for an adult, and this is for a child. You can even say adolescent. Now, how do I know what the difference between the two are? Well, like we said before, when you reach an adult age or after you are hitting puberty and puberty is finished, you don't need to have the epiphyseal plate. But when you do have the need to continue to go through growth spurts, etc., you will see the epiphyseal plate here. Now, the reason why you can see a lot of stuff as a child is this here epiphyseal plate is going to be the site of your bone growth. And as you get older, it's no longer there, right? And that's how you only have your articular cartilage on the outside for adults. Now, what is that going to be called now? Well, once you actually are done with your growth and puberty has finished and your bones are not going to be growing anymore, then it becomes it goes from an epiphyseal plate to an epiphyseal line. And that is going to convert to compact bone. As you can see, you're seeing that that line is now filled. Now you can say, well, how do I know it's compact bone? There are no holes in this little area right here. Let me erase this so you can see a better view. There are no holes in these little areas right here. There are no holes. So that epiphyseal line, or sorry, epiphyseal plate becomes an epiphyseal line and becomes compact bone. And that's the beauty of it. So when you're looking at x-rays and you're like, well, how can I distinguish? Well, first things first, you can know you're dealing with an adult if you actually see these epiphyseal lines. But with the child, on an x-ray, you'll see spaces where cartilage is. So if it's still going to be an epiphyseal plate here or have that cartilage, you'll see that there's going to be a space on the actual x-ray. And it kind of looks like this. Let me try to explain it. It kind of looks like all the bones are in little pieces because we have that hyaline cartilage, and that doesn't show up well on x-ray. Okay? Just keep that in mind. Now, when you're a child, you're going to have a larger epiphyseal plate, and then as you go into adolescence, and then you're going all the way closer to puberty, it will get thin like we see here. Once you hit an adult, it will become compact bone. Folks, let's get into some more detail. Like, well, if we already said from knowing about osseous tissue that the bone has a really great vasculature and it has a good amount of blood and nerves and everything, where does that come in when it comes to a long bone? So that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on long bones here. I will talk about short bones and how they get their little nutrients and stuff, but our focus right now is going to be the long bone. We know bones are going to be living and dynamic. We've been talking about that the whole time, right? And when we talk about a long bone, we also know that it's going to be made of spongy bone at the epiphyses. And of course, the diaphyses, or the shaft, is going to be compact bone only with the medullary cavity. And we also said that bone is going to contain blood vessels and nerves, a good amount of them, because that's the reason why bone can heal faster. But let's think about compact bone. Compact bone is going to be usually impenetrable. So the goal is for it to be thick enough so if you hit a bone, it can actually be able to absorb some of that impact and not just automatically break, right? So then the question becomes, if that's really, really compact, how do they actually get nutrients and any blood and nerves inside of this? And also just think about it. If you do break a bone, there's going to be a lot of blood, but you're definitely going to feel it because you have nerves in there as well. Well, folks, the way that our long bones are going to end up getting nutrients or blood vessels and nerves into the actual bone itself, or into the actual diaphyses, and then of course to the rest of the actual piece of spongy bone and compact bone as well, is through what's called a nutrient foramen. Now we're going to be talking about bone markings later, but a foramen is basically an opening or a hole, if you will, opening, or really it's like a hole in my opinion, through a bone. And what it does is that hole can actually provide certain vasculature or innervations like nerves to go through that. And when it comes to long bones, they usually have one single nutrient foramen that is able to bring in arteries and veins, and of course nerves. The nerve is going to be the yellow one here. Arteries are red. And of course, the veins are going to be blue. Okay? So if you're thinking about this, you just say it's a small hole at this point. Okay, and it's going to be in the diaphysis for blood vessels and nerves. You have the nutrient arteries that are going to bring blood into the medullary cavity, and nutrient veins that carry blood out of the bone. And then of course you have nerves that pass through. The first question people ask is always like, if there's only one of them, how do we get so much blood, and how is it so great in that regard? Well, guess what? Those arteries and veins and nerves can then expand into all the little crevices of the spongy bone and up throughout the medullary cavity, and that's how it kind of bleeds through. Okay? And sometimes, or most of the time, you only have one nutrient foramen for a long bone. So sometimes when you go into lab and you actually look at the anatomy of the long bone itself, you should be able to see that nutrient foramen with that little hole that's on the outside of the diaphysis. Okay, but of course, that can vary, so some folks can have more. And spongy bone is interesting because spongy bone can have smaller little holes that we call foramina that are located in the metaphysis and the epiphysis. Reiterate, we know the metaphysis is going to be where the epiphysis and diaphysis meet. So we have our little long bone here. We got all of our spongy bone. We definitely might have a epiphyseal line or plate, and then we will have our diaphysis cavity here, right? Well, guess what? You can actually see smaller little foramina That can be right where the metaphysis is or on the epiphysis. And so when you're thinking about long bones, yes, they can have that nutrient foramen that is on the diaphysis, and then also they can have smaller foramina that's going to be at the epiphysis areas or the metaphyses, where the diaphyses and epiphyses connect. And if we go further and we talk about all the other bones, so the short bones, the irregular bones, the flat bones, the sesamoid bones, right? Then they're going to have a smaller foramina all around. So let's just say we have a small or short bone here. This short bone will have its own smaller poles of foramina that again is going to bring in blood vessels and nerves for nutrients. And of course, I have an image here that I want to show everyone about, and this is from your book, of what that looks like. So again, we have our medullary cavity. That's what I'm We have our medullary cavity here. We have our yellow marrow. We have our periosteum. We see those purpurary fibers and those collagen fibers. And then on the outer layer, we see the osteoprogenitor cells. We see our nutrient foramen right here. And we also see an artery going into the nutrient foramen, and that's going to supply blood all through the central canals of the osteon that we see here. Okay, we also see osteon here. And if we would see spongy bone, then we'll see smaller foramina that's going to allow for the vasculature to go that way. Let's look at an overall diagram as well, just to end it off. So in your book, you also see a whole area of, hey, here's the epiphyses, and the way we can actually distinguish between the epiphyses is going to be proximal epiphyses versus distal epiphyses. And we already know we have two, so one is proximal, one is distal. And then we have the diaphyses here. Spongy bone, epiphyseal line or plate, depending on if it's adult or adolescent. Periosteum, which is going to be the outer connective tissue layer. Endosteum is going to be the inner connective tissue layer, which we'll see around here. All around here. Okay? Medullary cavity, yellow marrow, nutrient foramen, purpurary fibers of the actual periosteum here that we know is a part of collagen as well that weaves into the bone matrix. So all those little details just helping you review this stuff. Okay, folks, let's move on to the next video.